So first of all, if we look at the markets of Asia as a whole, there are some similarities to dealing or getting into Asian wine markets. Obviously, you have language differences within all these countries and cultural differences. There's a lack of understanding about market dynamics, a lack of relevant and reliable data. In Asia, we don't have the equivalent of AC Nielsen or Euromonitor or any of these major marketing resource companies. So we kind of like muddle together any sort of custom statistics there are or figures, and there are a few market research companies that are doing limited interviews with people, but there's no retail monitoring of any type. So what I usually do is I take 3 or 4 relatively reliable sources, including the customs import data, and I sort of average them together to get what I think is a realistic figure. And there's conflicting messages about wine with very little unbiased advice. Most of the advice that you're getting and the information that you get comes from a wine company who has an agenda. The major wine markets of Asia are Japan, China, Hong Kong, Singapore. South Korea and Taiwan are very strong markets as well. And I've just put India in there in brackets. Whether you want to include it as part of Asia or not is one of the reasons that I put it in brackets. But the other reason is it's very slowly emerging compared to the rest of Asia. And most of that has to do with some extortionate taxes that they have on wine there at the moment. So if we look at the major Asian wine markets, there you have Japan and China pretty much neck and neck at the moment. And this is very recent. Well, I remember when I first moved to Singapore, Japan was way up there. Oh, sorry, I should say that I moved to Singapore about 4 years ago. Japan was way up there, and China was probably about halfway up that graph. The other real significant change that's happened since I moved to Singapore is Hong Kong overtaking Singapore. Hong Kong and Singapore were pretty much neck and neck for a very long time. And then, of course, 2008 came. 2008 came, duty abolished, and all of a sudden, Hong Kong shot straight up there. Now, one thing that Deborah didn't mention, which is a bit of a touchy subject, is there's a lot of cross-border trading between Hong Kong and China. So some of that Hong Kong figure is kind of being black marketed over into China. And that's another sort of difficulty in saying exactly what the figures are. But incredible how quickly Hong Kong and China have come on in recent years. This is another interesting graph that I put together. Japan and China produce a lot of their own wine, and I'll talk a little bit about Japan when we get to there. China is producing more and more wine every year. The best wines, some of the wineries that Deborah pointed out, Grace and places like, well, some of the dynasty wines that they do and the top wineries, they will make legitimate wine, and some of it is very expensive. But a lot of the wine that's consumed there is a little bit of Chinese wine mixed with bulk wine, cheap bulk wine from other countries coming in, and it's just bottled as Chinese wine. They don't have any laws or anything about that, so that's why that figure looks a little bit funny. You think, wow, they're producing an awful lot of wine, and they are producing an awful lot of wine, but an awful lot of that domestic figure is actually imported wine going into there. Same with Japan. Japan doesn't have any laws, like we do in most producing countries, about labeling laws. So in Japan, there is actually a law that you have to have at least 5% Japanese wine before you can label it as Japanese. And that's kind of a joke too, because most of the really cheap bulk wine that's being consumed in Japan as Japanese wine doesn't even have any Japanese wine in it. The cost of production in Japan for wine is the reason for that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. These are some of the emerging wine markets in Asia. I do quite a bit of work in all of these markets in terms of education and wine events. I would say don't forget to look at them. There's some incredible niche opportunities in each of these markets. Thailand is a solid market, but very high taxes on wine going in there. Now, most of the best importers have ways of getting around those taxes, but it's actually a very strong market, particularly for premium wines. Vietnam is the same. They have relatively high taxes on wine. We're talking about anywhere between 300 and 400% on the CIF cost. Cambodia. I was just doing some work in Cambodia a couple of months ago. And I hadn't realized until then that they actually have very, very low, almost nothing in terms of taxes on wine. So that's a strong market to look for. Their economy is doing relatively well now, and something that to certainly pursue. They've got probably 4 or 5 really strong importers there as well. So certainly have a look there. Malaysia, Indonesia, difficult markets. They're mainly Muslim. Indonesia in particular has like black periods where you can't get any wine into the country because the government just decides it's going to crack down on alcohol and it's not going to let anything through. Now, of course, you can get things through, but it takes a hefty bribe. And there's a lot of that going on in Indonesia. And the Philippines can be a relatively good market. But as Deborah mentioned, they have a real sweet tooth there. And it really takes a lot of conditioning to get them to actually like the taste of wine. Whereas other markets like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, the locals there are very embracing of wine straight away and the flavors of wines. This is actually probably a little bit higher. This is from the 2010 OIV figures. Asia now accounts for about 7.3% of global wine consumption, and it's growing fast. And I've just put that in there. It was 1.9% 20 years ago. So that's a huge chunk of the global wine consumption that it's taken over in just a few years. Here are some of the trends for Asia-Pacific wine markets in general. They are the fastest growing wine markets in the world, generally speaking. But wine is less than 5% of alcohol consumption in most Asian markets. Most people don't realize that. And Asia-Pacific consumes 50.6% of the world's spirits and is still growing, albeit at a much slower rate. So we're talking double figures for most Asian wine markets when it comes to wine in terms of growth. Spirits is slowing right down now. I mention these two figures because I occasionally get asked, you know, as we go into Asia and we're promoting wine and we're educating about wine, people say, oh, aren't you making, you know, countries of alcoholics then? No. Most Asian wine markets, most consumers in Asian wine markets drink a lot of alcohol. In some places like Japan, it's almost a rite of passage. There's a general preference in almost all of the Asia's wine markets for red wine. The country with the highest proportion of white wine drinking is actually Japan. They're about 60-40 right now, 60%, 40% white. In other countries like China, for example, even Thailand and Singapore, it's overwhelmingly red, about 80-20. In Singapore, more like 70-30, but 80-20 in most markets. I'll talk about why with Singapore in a little bit when I get to the Singaporean market. The strong demand for French wines, that's not a new story and very Bordeaux-centric, generally speaking, straight across Asia. Proportion of on-trade consumption is generally higher than in the West. So in most markets like, for example, the UK or the USA, it's 80% off-trade, 20% on-trade. It's kind of flip-flopped in Asia, with Singapore, I think, probably has the highest proportion of off-trade. And that is more like 70%.